On today with Amy Swear of the Heritage Foundation. How are you today, Amy?
Good. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate your time here. I wanted to get you on because last week, former Labor Secretary under President Clinton made a fairly incendiary statement on Twitter regarding gun violence in the United States. He said mass shootings in the U.S. and listed off a number of years from 2014 to 2022, listing the increase in mass shootings that have occurred each year. And then he wrote, in the first 7 weeks of 2023, there have been 67. We do not have to live like this. No other country on the planet does. To which you responded, Chicago, not the greater Chicago area, but just within the city limits, has less than 1% of the U.S. population, but is responsible for almost 8% of these shootings since 2014. In 7 of 9 years, it had more than the entire state of Texas. You're making the argument that we've seen more recently that a lot of this crime that we're seeing throughout the United States, including mass shootings, is not a national problem per se, but it's actually hyper localized.
Yeah, so the actual data that was being put forth in the original tweet, it uses a very specific definition of mass shooting. And I think it's important to recognize that, right? So most people, when they hear mass shooting, they think of something like Parkland or the Aurora Theater shooting, right? Where it's this sort of indiscriminate public shooting, right? They're not necessarily thinking gang-related shootouts in Chicago. But this definition, right, these data points that this individual is putting forward is this broader definition, which really from a public policy standpoint is meaningless because it captures a lot of completely unrelated types of crime. But my argument is, like, if you want to go there, if you want to use this broader definition of mass shooting where it includes essentially every type of shooting, no matter what the context, where it is, let's be honest about what the problem is, right? Because they're putting forward these numbers to say we have this massive mass shooting problem to scare people, to inflate these numbers. And the obvious response that they want is, okay, so we need gun control. Well, let's break down those numbers, right? Let's ask whether that gun control is actually working to prevent mass shootings in the places that already exist in the US. And they never want to break down that data, right? They want to say, oh, there's been 600 plus mass shootings. They don't want to say where they are. They don't want to say who's responsible for it. Because when you actually do that, when you do the math, when you look at the data and break it down, you find out that it's really not a matter of, oh, well, if we just put in more gun control, right? If we just had California's laws or Chicago's laws, the rest of us would be safe. Because that's not happening in Chicago, right? It's not even happening in California when you break down those numbers. So it's not fair or accurate to put forward that definition and not be willing to look at whether it gets you the result you want, which is gun control works.
So what is some of the data? Because we seem to have a lot of these conversations where one side is extremely well informed, the other side is less informed, but very, very passionate. And it leads to disastrous policies that make us feel like we're doing something but have little to no impact at all on reducing gun violence.
Yeah, so what you actually see when you look at, again, this gun violence archive definition where you get the 600 plus mass shootings is that there's really not a clear relationship between places that have strict gun control and lower rates of these mass shootings. And you see that really across the board with public safety generally, but for purposes of mass shootings, right? You have Chicago, which is not only in Illinois, which is very restrictive in and of itself, but Cook County, which is one of the most restrictive counties, and for a long time has had even more regulations imposed. You have Chicago, again, about 2 million people, responsible for almost 8% of mass shootings. Meanwhile, you have Texas, on the other hand. You look at gun control group scorecards, right? Texas is the quintessential F, like F minus if they could get it. Just a completely opposite approach to gun laws. And most years, Chicago has more mass shootings than the entire state of Texas, with roughly 30 million people. And then you look at, okay, well, maybe it's just Chicago, right? It's not just Chicago. You look at California, for example, with all of its gun laws. California at this point is like the gun control gold star, right? If gun control advocates could take the entire state of California's gun laws and put it at a federal level, they'd be thrilled, right? Well, when you look at how they compare with Texas for all of their various differences in gun laws, in terms of mass shootings, they're the same, right? They are functionally the same. And so if you're going to sit here and say, oh, well, we need all of these gun control laws, and the best you can do is say, well, we made them just as safe as the people in this other state who don't have their Second Amendment rights infringed, maybe the problem was deeper and more complex than too many people had too many guns and the Second Amendment's the problem.
And a lot of times what I see is people who are in these areas that have these strict gun control laws, Illinois, California, as you named, they blame red states and more laws that are more respecting of the Second Amendment as the problem, and saying, hey, people are bringing guns in from Illinois, they're bringing guns in from Missouri and other places. That's what's driving the crime here. But red states and cities more specifically that are governed by people who have passed legislation, again, in support of the Second Amendment and Americans' rights to be able to protect and bear arms, they're not seeing these issues in red areas.
Yeah, so I'd actually, just from a more general standpoint, I'd point you to a paper that my colleagues Zach Smith and Coley Stimson have written on this dynamic, where it's actually, you see specific, largely blue cities that are being inundated with crime, whether it's gun violence or not gun violence. But in terms of this idea of it's the fault of red states. You see this all the time with Chicago, where the root, according to gun control advocates, the root of Chicago's crime problem is Indiana's gun laws, which from a logical standpoint, if you understand federal law, doesn't make any sense, right? You can't cross state lines legally and just buy a gun without a background check and evade state laws. That's not how federal law works. So there's no logical connection. But on top of that, there's not even a connection that you see from crime itself. You would think that if Indiana's gun laws were the problem, Indiana would be similarly dangerous. And it's not the case at all. Indiana is actually, when it comes to mass shootings, about roughly equivalent to its population, right? So it's about 2% of the population. It has about 2% of mass shootings over the last 10 or so years. It's nothing like Chicago, which has less than 1% of the population and more than 8% of shootings, right? Indiana doesn't have that problem. In fact, the rest of Illinois does not have that problem. So what would make criminals say, oh, let's go terrorize this one specific city, but not the rest of it? That's not related to gun laws. That's related to other demographic, sociological, and community issues. That has nothing at all to do with gun laws. And until we recognize that and start dealing with these actual underlying issues, you can do all you want to impose gun control laws. And as you see in Chicago, that's not going to solve the problem.
So as far as solutions, how do we get to a point where we can even have honest conversations about this and start to move the needle on solving these issues?
Yeah. Well, I think, the first thing we need to do is continue to learn the facts about the problem, right? So you need to be able to take down these false narratives, but it also means that we need to understand what the real problem is, right? Which is, again, not gun control or a lack of gun control. It's deeper issues. And I think one of the primary issues that you see specifically in Chicago, where so many of these mass shootings are gang-related and these interpersonal disputes committed largely by people who are already prohibited from owning guns, who already have lengthy criminal records, is how do we deal with this small subset of the population that, often no more than a couple hundred people in a city of 2 million people, who are routinely terrorizing and who are routinely involved in a disproportionate amount of crime. So how do we essentially remove them from the population? How do we punish those individuals in such a way that they're not getting guns, right? That they don't have the opportunity to continue terrorizing and render those communities safer? But also, how do we fix more systemic issues, right? How do we fix, for example, in Cook County, a prosecutor who often just declines to prosecute people convicted of violent gun crimes? How do we fix that? How do we enable more people, law-abiding citizens, to defend themselves in public? How do we fix systemic issues within communities related to, lack of opportunities other than crime-related opportunities? How do we fix education? How do we fix broken homes and broken families? These things that so often lead to very disfavorable outcomes for individuals who are surrounded by them. And that's a very different issue that not only, when we look at solving that, solves things related to crime and criminal justice and gun violence, it solves bigger issues within communities and that come down to really at their core, human thriving, right? How do we help humans thrive? And when we start addressing those issues, we're going to get so much farther on so many things, not just gun violence, right? But everything else related to a thriving society.
Amy, real quick, for people who want to find you, where can they do so?
So you can always follow me on Twitter at Amy Swear, just at first name, last name, or you can check out what I'm doing at the Heritage Foundation's website, which is heritage.org, or our multimedia arm, dailysignal.com.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you for having me.